Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Farm Table Foundation's class with Sylvia Burgos-Toftness, who also happens to be our board chair, so very involved in the organization. It's great to see you all for this evening's class in the middle of the summer or toward the end of the summer. And we've got a great class in that regard, and that we'll be teaching some freezing of summer's bounty. So my name is Mike Scott, and I'm the program director and director for community partnerships at Farm Table. And our mission really is to reconnect folks to farmers, local food, and the land. And part of in a way, the healing process that local food can bring to all of us. And our mission is to rebuild local food culture. Sylvia is part of that local food culture, and that we purchase some of grass-fed beef products from her. She's a grass-fed beef farmer. So Sylvia, thank you for being with us, and please feel free to say more about your work as a farmer as well, and jump right in. And welcome everybody again.
Well, hi everyone. This is so much fun. I never thought, well, who would have thought that we'd all be involved in Zooming like this from many, many parts of the country.
And then Beth has a question here. Why freezing versus canning the fruit, I think is what she's asking.
Good question. And that helps us actually kind of start right off. Because this is about freezing. It is not about canning. And so it's a very different process with lots of advantages, but with some limitations. Canning is that process by which we can actually take produce from the garden. We could actually take vegetables. You can even do meat and fish. And we cook it. And then we put it into the canning jars and we process it. And we either process it in a big kettle of boiling hot water, and that's called water bath canning. Or we actually do it in a really big modified processor, a pressure cooker. We pressure cook foods that have very low acidity. And so when you're doing many different kinds of beans, or when you're doing any kind of foods that don't have much acid in them, you must pressure can them. And what we're talking about today is neither one of those. And thereby is the limitation. When you can something, whether it's in a pressure canner or in a hot water bath, you are stabilizing the shelf life. You are extending the shelf life of that particular food. It is shelf stable, which means you can put it into your cupboard, you can put it into your root cellar, and it will remain safe. When you freeze something, just as we're going to discuss here, you're cooking it, you're preparing it, you're making something good out of it, but it must be stored in its frozen state in order to be safe. And it is not shelf stable. You cannot take it out of the freezer and then decide to put it into your cupboard. That would not be either very delicious for very long or safe. Once you take something frozen, and in this case, we're talking about jams and preserves. When you take them out of the freezer, they have to be stored in the refrigerator. Now, one of the things that's an advantage of doing this in this freezing is that although it's not shelf stable, it's usually faster to prepare, and you can do it in very small batches. If you've ever canned anything, and there may be some people out there who have, there are many, many rules to follow about how you should can your foods. And the rules are there for a really good purpose. You do not want to have that food spoil because it was not canned properly. That leaves anybody who eats out of that spoiled food leaves them open to botulism, which is a deadly, deadly way to suffer after eating something that's not been canned properly. That said, most canning is done very, very successfully, so don't be put off from doing that. When you freeze something, on the other hand, You're cooking it, you're preparing it, you're letting that food come back down to room temperature, and then you're sticking it in your freezer. And that's what preserves it. Now, there's still some rules to follow. Your equipment's got to be clean. You've got to get that food, that jam or jelly, the preserve, the conserve, at a good hot simmering before you put it into hot jars and put them away. First, to get down to room temperature, you'd ever want to stick something that's boiling hot in the freezer. That's asking for an explosion, a crack in the glass. But once it comes to room temperature and you put it in the freezer, you can keep it for a long time. And today what we're talking about are jams and fruit butters and preserves that can be done in small batches. And by small batches, I mean really small, like 2 8-ounce glasses. So if you have just a few things coming in from the farmer's market, from your garden, or from your CSA box, you can make these jams, preserves, fruit butters, and most of them take under an hour. And so I think what we're going to do now is I'm going to take you into a slideshow that includes a little bit of video so that we can see what the various steps are to going from, well, let's see, going from this fresh plum to a jar of plum preserves. All right. So again, we're talking about jams and preserves, cool jams and preserves, stuff in small batches for the freezer. Now, one of the, like I said, there are advantages to this approach. First of all, there tends to be quick to make. I made, I don't know, 6 batches in the last 2 days. None of them took over an hour. They're fairly easy. They don't require a lot of very complicated technique. If you know how to simmer something, you can make these jams. They're small batch. Again, we're talking about working with a pound and a half of fruit in order to make a jam or preserve in small jars. And again, it's not shelf stable, but it is thrifty because not only can you do it using these, canning jars, the ball jars, the ones that were created in order to do the hot water bath. Well, it turns out that they work really well for freezing. And you can use your own jars, things that you already have at home. And we will actually talk about that a little more. So you use what you've got on hand and you preserve the flavors of the season. What you see right there, those are pitted sweet cherries that I was able to purchase in volume about a month ago. At that time, I didn't have time for making jams, jellies, or anything else. So I pitted them and I froze them and was able to use them yesterday for the that we're going to be looking at. We use what's in our kitchen. So most of us have a skillet. When you make something like a jam or a fruit butter or a preserve, we're looking to use a wide, heavy bottomed skillet made either stainless steel or enameled cast iron. Do not and will not use either aluminum or bare cast iron because both of those metals will react to the acidity in our fruit jam. And boy, it'll create a really bad off taste to the final product. You've got measuring cups and spoons. You've got a scale, and that's simply to get to the amount of fruit, to have a good understanding of how much fruit you've got on hand. Knife and a cutting board, so you see one there. In fact, I used that cutting board and knife yesterday to cut up candied ginger, which is one of the recipes that you received. You want a large mouth funnel. And after we get off of this slideshow, I'll actually show you what that looks like. If you don't have a wide mouth funnel, you can still make your jam, jelly, preserve very successfully. So don't worry too much about that. Strainers. What we want is something that'll help separate the fruit skin from the flesh. Should you be working with a fruit that has a peel or flesh that simply does not break down? Then big spoons and spatulas.
Sylvia?
Yeah.
How do you know if you have an enameled cast iron or not? Is it obvious to people?
You know, after this slideshow is done, I will show you one so that we can see it. An enameled cast iron skillet is shiny and it usually has a color. So it's green or orange or blue or red, and it looks like a heavy coat of paint. Bare cast iron looks like metal. And so we'll look at those two things. All right, so you work with the fruit on hand and you work with the spices that you might have on hand. What you see in that picture there, of course, you see some vanilla extract. You see some little curls of cinnamon. Beneath the cinnamon is nutmeg. Those star-shaped spices are actually called star anise. In front of the vanilla to its left is allspice. The greenery on the left is basil. The greenery on the right is lemon balm. And the yellow is lemon. Then we've got sugar, and we use lemon juice. And bottled is preferred. And that bottled lemon juice is really highly preferred when you are canning because of the many safety measures that you want to take to make sure that your food is properly prepared. Why bottled lemon juice? Well, it's because the pH, the acidity of a fresh lemon can vary tremendously, one lemon to the other. I don't know if anybody's ever experienced or purchased and tried cooking with a kind of lemon called a Meyer lemon, which is very sweet, has a thin skin, and lower acidity. But even in the regular lemons that we buy, let's say at the grocery store, there's variance there. However, with bottled lemon juice, what you've got is a standardized, regulated pH level that helps us with the safety of foods. It also helps us with developing the right kind of texture in a jam, a jelly, a fruit butter, or a preserve. So it actually works in that area as well. All right, so let's see what we've got here. All right, again, I also was able to get a big box of blueberries that ended up in the freezer as well. Now, when it comes to making our jams and jellies, and actually I'll take that back, we're not making a jelly. Our jams and fruit butters and preserves, this is a real basic generalization of the ratio of the fruit to sugar. For every kind of fruit, you get there. Look at those kinds of measurements. Very often when you go to a canning book, what you will find that their ratios for jams and preserves and butters, and especially for jams, their ratios are much more sugar to fruit. And so we're looking at something here that has less in it, but we've got that latitude because we are freezing not canning. So we get a little bit of an opportunity to play with these ratios a bit as we move forward. Although both the sugar and the lemon play a big role in helping to develop the nice texture that you want in a jam. And for the, before we get into the basic steps, I guess one of the things that maybe you have or have not had an opportunity to look at is that there is a difference between a jelly and a jam, a preserve, a conserve, a chutney. And they all have to do with how much whole or chopped fruit there might be in the final product. So a jelly is made only with fruit juice, sugar, and pectin. A jam has chopped up and sometimes very finely chopped up fruit in addition to the sugar. And if you're canning it, it probably has some pectin in there as well. But what is this thing? I mean, why does jelly need pectin and jam need pectin? Why is it a basic ingredient in these preserved fruits? Pectin is a naturally occurring carbohydrate. And it tends to be higher. There's more pectin in high acid fruits than there is in low acid fruits. That's why when we can something that is low acid, we add pectin to it. What pectin does is it actually helps the fruit gel or form that nice firm texture that we enjoy when we spread it on bread. Okay, so here are the basic steps. Get back to this. First, assemble all the equipment and ingredients within arm's reach so that you're not jumping up and down and wondering, where is this thing that I need? You clean fruit, and then you prepare it as per the recipe. So in some recipes, you quarter it. Some recipes, you take out a stone pit. In others, you quarter it and then slice it. Some apple butters ask that you core and peel the apple before you slice it up. So you look at the recipe for that. Then you combine the fruit and the sugar and the lemon juice. At this point, you might also add a spice that you enjoy. So sometimes people who are working with blueberries will add lemon and ginger, or lemon and basil, making for a really flavorful, delicious combination. Well, you take that fruit, sugar, and lemon juice, and you heat it over medium heat till it gets to a simmer. Stirring, stirring, stirring all the while. Because one of the things that we know about making these fruit jellies and whatever is that because of their high sugar content, and because we're making it in a really wide skillet, they will begin to bubble and burn really quickly. So you want to stay on top of it, stirring frequently. Then you go, again, you raise it to a low boil. You go 10 to 20 minutes, stirring frequently until your jam or preserve reaches the right consistency and has, in fact, activated enough pectin to make for that firm texture that you're looking for. And you test for the set. To test for the set means to test if it's gelled, or are you looking at a big pot of sauce instead of a jam? And we'll talk a little bit more about testing for set. It is not rocket science, thank goodness. All right, now once it's set, once you feel that you've got the right consistency, then you put your preserve, you conserve your jam or fruit butter into a jar, and you cover it. You let it cool to room temperature, you label it, and then you freeze it. Now I'll tell you, I made, I think, 5 batches in the last couple of days. I put them out on the counter, And already this morning, I was forgetting what was in the jar. So keep your masking tape and Sharpie on hand so that you can not get lost in your beautiful freezer full of these glittering jars. Okay. All right, so here we are taking a look at rhubarb, which is the first great fruit of the spring. Oh, I just love it when rhubarb is coming. Oh yes, we got through the winter. Now we can look forward to a great season. And one of the things that you do after you wash off your rhubarb and discard the leaves, because the leaves of rhubarb are toxic, is you chop them up. Look at those nice skills. I wish, huh? Nothing like those little apps to make these little videos come alive. And then for the recipe that I shared with you, you take that rhubarb, you combine it with sugar and other spices in order to roast it in the oven. And here we're looking at obviously a Pyrex deep dish kind of plate that it can withstand the 350 degrees for 25 to 30 minutes. Oh, you can see it bubbling away. Gets mighty hot. All right. Now, that was rhubarb. And for the recipe that you have, the rhubarb was put into the oven and roasted. You can make your jams with rhubarb on your stovetop, no problem. Of course, you'll have a slightly different flavor because roasting does add a caramelization to the fruit that you wouldn't get on a stovetop. Excuse me. But here it is. Here are nectarine pieces simmering, simmering, simmering on the stovetop. That's one of the steps of getting this done. So instead of roasting it, we used a very wide skillet with a very heavy bottom. And the heavy bottom is important because that helps distribute the heat throughout the bottom and prevent hot spots and scorching. And we've got it at a good low boil. So why have a wide skillet? I mean, why not just put it into a regular saucepan? One of the things that you want to do is you want to cook it, but you also want to make sure that as much that moisture is evaporated from the fruit mixture, because you want to thicken it. And thickening happens faster in a very wide vessel. So if I had this in a saucepan and I wanted to get it thick, I'd have to cook it considerably longer because the surface area was smaller. And what might happen is that I'd have to cook it for so long that I might lose the fresh texture of the fruit. And so that's why jelly pans and various jam pans and fruit butter pans are wide. And because these are small batch, you can easily do it in a 10 and 12 inch wide skillet. So this is a stainless steel skillet. All right. Well, how long do you allow your fruit to simmer? When do you know when it's done? Well, here we're looking at the blueberry and candied ginger jam I made yesterday. And one of the things that you cannot eat, because this is color is everything else here, is there is a small bag made out of cheesecloth, just a little square cheesecloth, in which I had placed, believe it or not, lemon membranes and seeds. So you know the inside of a lemon that's left over after you've squeezed out all the juice? That's what's in that little bag. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But right now, I'm going over this jam with my spoon. One, you stir almost constantly in order to prevent scorching. But I'm also testing for the set. Is it thick enough? Is it thick enough? Ah, oops, that went too far. What I'm looking for is when I use that spoon to move the jam, does it leave a path that is the bottom of the pot? And does that path get immediately filled back in by the fluid, or does it remain for a while? And here we have it remaining. So this is done. That's what you look for. Sometimes it doesn't work that well if you use a spoon. You might need a spatula. That'll do a better job of revealing whether or not your jam is done. Once it's done, you pour the jam into hot jars, clean, hot jars. You want them hot in order to minimize the shock of that boiling jam into the jar. You cover it with a lid. You allow it to cool to the room temperature, and then you freeze. You let it freeze and you keep it frozen until you want it. Then you pull it out, open it, you enjoy it, and anything that's left in that jar goes back into the refrigerator for safe storage. All right. Now, to get back to the Zoom screen. Stop share. Okay, here we are. Here we are. Thank you for your patience with my lack of knowledge of the technologies. Every time I do this, it's like, where are things? But that kind of is the process in a real quick fashion. And at this point, I guess I'd like to see if, or hear if there are any other questions out there.
Sylvia, do you get the jars hot by just dipping them in hot water, essentially?
What I do is I wash them out in hot water with soap, rinse them out very well, and then I make for really, really hot water, sometimes just below boiling or boiling water in them, and then set them on the counter on a kitchen towel, so that you also don't have any kind of shock between the temperature of that jar and your counter. Then when I need to use that jar, I carefully tip out that hot water and immediately fill it.
Great. And Beth asks, can we do the same kind of process, but do it for pie filling?
I believe you can. If you're going to freeze it, that's what you do. You know, again, it's the whole notion of be aware that this is not shelf stable, but you can freeze just about anything. I know I make curds, so lemon curd and cranberry curd, honeyberry curd, rhubarb curd. I make those as I normally would, and then I put it into hot jars, cover them, and freeze them, and they freeze beautifully. What you want to make sure that you do is when you fill your jar, you leave sufficient space at the top of the jar. That's called head space. You want to leave a ½ inch at least, so that as your, whether it's apple pie filling or pumpkin filling or whatever, or your fruit jam, as it freezes, it'll expand. And so you don't want it to push up through the lid and perhaps compromise not only the seal, but also you might crack a jar that way. Any other questions at the moment?
Not at the moment, but feel free to type them in, folks.
Oh, please do. I'm looking forward to questions. How many of you might be apprehensive to try something like this? I wouldn't blame you. If I've never done it before, I'd be wondering, you know, is it worth it? Am I going to spoil everything? Am I going to poison myself? Well, you're not going to poison yourself if you just follow, you know, the instructions that are provided, and keep things frozen. Keep them frozen, and understand that once you open it up, you've got to stick it in the fridge. In fact, with many of these jams and conserves, if you choose not to freeze them, they'll stay safely in your refrigerator for at least 2 weeks. So, I mean, that's another way if you're preparing for an event, you can do this. You know, one of the things I guess that a lot of us don't know is a pound of plums. That sounds like a lot. Let me show you what a pound of plums looks like. I'll be stepping out for a second. This is a pound. It's just 3 big fruits. So when you go to the grocery store, if you want to just experiment with this, buy 3 that add up to a pound and go ahead, start off. Again, doing these kinds of jams and conserves and fruit butters for freezing is a lot more flexible than trying to do it for canning. When you are canning, there are precise instructions that you really do need to follow. And that includes how big a batch or how many pounds of fruit or vegetable you start off with. You are discouraged from doubling a batch to can or even having it to can. But when you're doing it to freeze, you've got a lot more latitude. You still have to make sure things are heated up well and your jars are hot, but you don't have the kind of concern that you have with canning. So you have a lot of leeway that you can play with, because a pound in most cases isn't that much in the way of a particular fruit. One of the things I really liked in this little experiment to make a whole lot of batches for today was how much I enjoyed the nectarines. I love nectarines to eat. But one of the things that's a real plus is that they tend to have a fairly mild flavor, and they combine so well with unexpected spices. For example, the recipe that you have is nectarines and cardamom. I'll tell you, it's delicious, absolutely delicious. Let's see, I'm just putting stuff back. Oh yeah, here's another plum. In fact, I've got the nectarine preserve right here. It's just a brilliant, just luminescent, kind of peachy orange, and so delicious. And when I made the plum, in fact, if you've got the recipe, or if you want to take a note, here's a change to that plum recipe. I added 2 tablespoons of dark rum to the fruit mixture as it was boiling. And I'll tell you, that added a whole new dimension to it. And in the recipes that you have, and I know it's long, it's 5 pages because there's other information there, you can see that there are flavor combinations that you might want to play with. For me, the fun of all of this, and I've canned for many years, is that it's small batch. Now, as soon as I start doing my tomatoes, I'll be doing, 14, 15, 16, 20 quarts at a time. But for this, it was just a lot of fun to do 2 8-ounce glasses. That's what a half pint is. There's the plum, 2 8-ounce glasses at a time. And most of the time, it took only 45 minutes to make. So I was really, really happy being able to do this. Also, if, these are supposed to be going into your freezer, it's nice to be able to do small batch because you may not have this freezer space for much more. I mean, that's the plus of canning. Because canned products are shelf stable, you can do 100 quarts and just stick them wherever you want, you know, under the bed, in a closet, you know, in the garage, and they're going to be shelf stable for 1 to 2 years. But this is really kind of neat. It's very versatile, and you can try different things as fruits become available. One of the things I noticed, and I don't know, has anybody out there tried to actually buy canning jars or canning supplies recently? I was just at a couple of stores that were absolutely bare. One was the big box, and one was a smaller grocery store. There are no canning jars available right now. If you go online, you will unfortunately discover that canning jars right now are being sold at 2 to 3 times the price that they were sold at from last year. And in fact, I went to look for some pectin. Remember, pectin is that carbohydrate that helps your jelly and your jam and your fruit butter and your preserves to gel. Well, turns out there's a humongous demand for that too. So much so that the price has quadrupled in some instances. What's kind of neat about the recipes that you have right now is that it makes use of the natural pectin within the fruit. And so you don't have to add pectin to the recipes that you have. But let's say you want to make your next batch a little bit more firm. And pectin is like through the roof expensive right now in many places. Not in all places, you can kind of look around. You can actually make your own natural pectin using green apples. And although I did not provide you with the recipe for doing that, I will try to get it to Mike over the next couple of days. So if you're ever interested in actually doing that and boosting the gelling capacity of your next jars of jams and preserves, you'll kind of know how to do it. Because obviously people did it before there was pectin commercially available in boxes. Although one of the things that you may or may not know is that canning, you know, this thing that is on people's minds right now, people are doing it because stuff is just flowing out of our gardens and CSA boxes. Canning has only been around since the 1850s and really didn't get hugely popular, I think, until the 1880s. So those canning jars are still kind of a new thing to the market, and people used different kinds of preservation techniques prior to canning. And when it comes to canning, Americans are the ones who do it the most. So now we're just using those canning jars to freeze, and they work very, very well for that.
Sylvia, can you use jars other than the canning jars, though, like a peanut butter jar, or as long as it's glass and solid?
Yes, you can. Thank you for that question, because that's where we were going right next. I just pulled out another kind of jar myself. Yeah, so here was a jelly jar, a jam, actually it was a preserve jar. And I love to save jars because why not? We can use them. Yes, by all means. Just make sure it's really, really, really well cleaned, that it doesn't have too much of nicks or anything on it. You don't want to inadvertently get anything in your food. And what you might want to do is once you've washed it, you've had hot water sitting in it, you've emptied it out, you've put your jam in here, you may want to cover it loosely, right? And let it come to room temperature. Just set it aside for, you know, the couple of hours it needs to come to the room temperature. Then you might want to open it up and actually use some some plastic wrap. I'm just cutting a piece right here. You may want to use some plastic wrap. You know, cut a piece of it. You don't have to use the whole thing. Put it over the mouth of your jar. Put it over the mouth of your jar. And then recap it in order to have an even tighter seal. Why do this? I mean, it's already frozen. It's not that it's going to flow anywhere. But amazingly enough, food can pick up off flavors just from sitting in the freezer. And after all the work that you've done, you don't want an off flavor in your delicious fruit jam. That's why I recommend doing that. It's also why, you know, this is an aside, why I always put butter into freezer bags before storing them in the freezer. Because butter will pick up off flavors faster than you can count 1, 2, 3. It just is horrible how, if you're actually baking a lot, how that can make for a sad result if you don't keep those off flavors off your butter. So yes, you use those home jars that you've kept.
Ray, and you mentioned apple butter a number of times.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like it's essentially the same recipe and process, but I remember my mom's apple butter was always really smooth. Do you sometimes puree or need to treat the end product one more time before freezing it, depending on what you're making?
Yes, in fact, my recipes included 2 ways of getting to that smooth apple butter, which I just love. So the first way is to actually peel, core, and quarter your apples before putting them into a slow cooker, which is what I use, or I also use a huge kettle because I make applesauce and apple butter in humongous quantities. That's one way to do it. So you core and peel and quarter before you start your cooking process. Another way is to just quarter your apples, skin is left on, the core is left on, and you put it into your big cauldron or you put it into your slow cooker, just like that. In both instances, you cook this down. Now, if you peeled and cored your apples first, you're going to have a fairly smooth product right off the bat. You may want, once you get to the applesauce stage, you may actually want to smash it like with a potato smasher in order to get it smoother, or you may want to go in there with a immersion blender and really smooth it out at that applesauce stage. And then you want to continue cooking it more until you get to the consistency of the apple butter, and that'll give you a smooth product. Now, I've made apple butter that's so concentrated that it requires no additional sugar at all. And it has a tang of the apple. But you can determine, you can add brown sugar to it. Some people add honey. I prefer the brown sugar flavor. You can decide to add spices. Lots of people add cinnamon. I prefer nutmeg in order to get your apple butter. Now, if you started this process with the cores and peels still on the apple, once the apples have gotten to that applesauce mushiness, you have to let that whole cauldron or slow cooker cool down to room temperature. Then you have to work in batches to remove the skins, the peels, the cores. And you do that with, there are all kinds of strainers. There is a Victoria strainer that's used for, lots of people use it for making tomato sauces. There's a Foley food mill which is a hand cranked affair that is still sold. I use it every single year in order to separate that wonderful apple flesh from the skins and the core and the seed. So you have to go through a second step, put it then back into your big pot or into your slow cooker, then to cook it down to the consistency that you want. And while you're doing that, you can then adjust for flavor. You know, is it as tangy as you want? Do you want to add some more spices to it? Sometimes I throw in some brandy at this point and let it continue cooking for another 2 to 3 to 4 hours until it gets to that consistency that you want. So it's a longer affair with apple butter, but it is so worth it. I just love apple butter. And you've got the recipes for both approaches in the packet that Mike sent out.
Yeah, you all should have received the recipes just shortly before the class, and we'll also make the video of this class available so you can watch it again or refer to it if need be. Does anyone have other questions? Or Sylvia, anything else you want to point out?
You know, I guess not. Just that whole notion of basic equipment. You probably have exactly what you need already in your home. I think making jams and preserves and conserves for the freezer is really thrifty. You know, use the jars that you have. Use the big skillet that you've got. Use your spoons and your sieves, whatever you've got on hand. This is a potato masher. I use it all the time when making these jams because you want to cut up, you want to break up some of the pieces. Works like a charm. It's really cheap. You don't have to stick it into a food processor. You can use this. Here's another implement that I use all the time when I'm cooking. It is a microplane. And I use it for adding fresh ginger to the recipes. I also use it with nutmeg sometimes when I want to add shavings of nutmeg, which taste and smell so much better than anything that you can buy powdered. Always have on hand your masking tape and your Sharpie. These two things, man, they saved me a lot of trouble and a lot of time, because sometimes I also use the masking tape to jot down when I started something and when it has to be ready so that I don't forget, especially if I've got a couple of pots going at the same time. Here's the big skillet that I use. And I think it's a good 12 inches across. Heavy bottom. It's a workhorse. And one of the things I really enjoyed about making these several small batches, one after the other, is that this thing cleans so well. Man, nothing stuck on it. I was very, very happy. And it's stainless steel. It is not a non-stick surface. I would not recommend a non-stick surface because of the possibility of flaking into your final product. All right. Now, somebody asked about enameled. How would they know if something is enameled? If you give me a second, I'm going to pull out my enameled skillet. Cast iron skillet that is just metal. It's very well cured. I've been working on it for a while, but I would not make a jelly, a jam, a conserve, a preserve. I would not make it in this because of the way that the acid would react with the metal. Here is an enameled cast iron pot. You see the green, like paint, thick enamel. Here's the inside, well used, well stained, white. It's like thick paint. This is an enameled pot. This will work well with acid foods. And so that's what you want to look for. Now, the beauty of an enameled cast iron implement like this is that it is so heavy, it really distributes the heat on the bottom evenly so that it reduces the opportunities for scorching your food. And that is a huge, huge plus, because with this wide surface comes quick evaporation, quick thickening of your jam, and you want to stay on top of it. Here are some of the books that, well, I'm sure many of you are already referring to, so forgive me if I'm telling you something a lot that you already know. But of course, this is the Ball, and Ball is a company that makes canning jars. They make both the Ball jar and the Mason jar. This is the complete book of home preserving. It's a go-to book, and it has been for generations. I'm sure that there are used copies all over the place. It's worth getting. It's just a really, really good resource. Another one is maybe one that you've seen at the grocery store even. This is their smaller Ball book with some of the basic recipes. And even though I've got both books, I go back to this one a lot as well, because it's got a really good recipe for tomato jam, which I really love. And this is another book with a focus on small batch preserving. And it's by the jar company called Weck, which is very popular overseas, but you can get Weck jars here as well. They tend to be very decorative. They're kind of expensive. But I like the book because of its focus on small batch. And in fact, if you look something up on the internet and you're thinking, well, you know, I kind of like the idea of doing something small, be sure that you kind of search for things like small batch, and that'll get you to the kind of recipes I think you might enjoy.
And thank you, Sylvia, for joining us.
Oh, sure. Thanks, everybody. I hope that you have a lot of good luck and find, you know, a pound of something that you'd love to make a jam out of. Enjoy it.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Eric.
Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Thank you.